Okay, let's unpack this. The world of psychological disorders. It's a landscape many of us navigate, right? Either personally or, through someone we know.
Absolutely. It touches almost everyone in some way.
Consider this step. About 1 in 4 adults in the U.S. is dealing with a diagnosable mental illness right now.
Wow, 1 in 4.
And almost half, that's 46%, will experience one in their lifetime. Just think about the sheer scale of that.
It's huge. And the impact it has, not just on individuals, but, well, society as a whole.
Yeah, the financial cost in the U.S. alone, it hits a staggering $467 billion every single year.
That number is hard to even grasp. It shows how deeply personal experiences carry such significant societal and economic weight.
Exactly. Fundamental aspects of human experience with these profound real-world consequences.
Hmm.
And for this deep dive, we're really focusing in on Chapter 14, which delves into psychological disorders.
Right.
Our mission isn't just to list symptoms, though. We want to try and understand what might be happening sort of beneath the surface.
Yeah, especially in the brain.
Particularly in the brain, yes, when conditions like schizophrenia take hold. We'll be connecting this back to our earlier talks about brain structure and neurotransmitters, too.
Precisely. We're aiming to go beyond just descriptions
Yeah.
and explore some of the underlying neural workings, like you said, based on what's outlined in Chapter 14.
Okay, so let's dive straight into schizophrenia then. Chapter 14 really highlights it as one of the more severe and, well, complex psychological disorders.
It is indeed a challenging condition. And as Chapter 14 details, our understanding of it has, it's evolved quite a bit over time.
Chapter 14 also points out that one of the first things researchers looked at was genetics. We've known for a while there's a family link, right?
That's correct.
Yeah.
Chapter 14 explains that studies, even going back decades, indicated schizophrenia tends to run in families. But identifying the specific genes responsible has been really tricky, a complex puzzle.
Why so complex?
Well, one of the main challenges, as the chapter mentions, has been inconsistencies in diagnosis, particularly when you consider what are called spectrum disorders.
Spectrum disorders. Okay, unpack that for me. What does Chapter 14 tell us about those?
So Chapter 14 describes them as conditions that, share some features with schizophrenia, but maybe don't meet all the criteria for a full diagnosis.
Ah, okay.
And what researchers found, cited in the chapter, is pretty interesting. They looked at identical twins where one had schizophrenia and the other didn't. They call this being discordant.
Right.
Even in those cases, a significant chunk of the non-schizophrenic twins still showed signs of these spectrum disorders.
Really? How significant?
We're talking figures like 48% to 54%, according to research highlighted in Chapter 14.
Wow, that's high.
It is. And it strongly suggests a shared underlying genetic susceptibility, even if it doesn't always fully manifest as schizophrenia.
So the key takeaway here is even with identical genes, something else must be at play: environment.
Exactly. Environmental factors likely play a crucial role in whether or not schizophrenia actually develops fully.
Here's where it gets really interesting. So if Chapter 14 suggests it's not just 1 or 2 genes, what kind of genetic picture are we talking about?
Well, Chapter 14 indicates the current thinking points towards schizophrenia, probably involving the combined effect of thousands of genes.
Thousands.
Yeah, thousands, each making a very small individual contribution to the overall risk. It's not like one single bad gene causing it.
Okay, so it's more like a complex interplay of many genetic variations.
Precisely. And this idea is supported by the observation, also noted in Chapter 14, that your risk increases both with the number of affected relatives you have and also how severe their condition is.
That makes sense, like reaching a kind of tipping point.
Kind of, yeah.
But if genes are only part of this complex picture, what other factors does Chapter 14 discuss?
That brings us nicely to the vulnerability model. It's a really important framework, also detailed in Chapter 14.
Okay, the vulnerability model. What's the gist?
It proposes that while our genes might create a predisposition, a vulnerability, environmental factors are often necessary to actually trigger the illness.
So like a loaded gun, but something needs to pull the trigger.
That's a good analogy.
Yeah.
Chapter 14 suggests there's a certain threshold of these causal forces, genetic and environmental, that needs to be exceeded for schizophrenia to develop. The genes create the predisposition, but life events often act as the catalyst.
So as Chapter 14 implies, it's not nature versus nurture, but really nature and nurture interacting.
Precisely. Chapter 14 outlines how these environmental challenges can combine with that underlying genetic vulnerability.
And push someone past that threshold.
Exactly. And these challenges can be external.
Mm-hmm.
Chapter 14 mentions things like bereavement, losing a job, divorce.
Major life stressors.
Right, but they can also be internal, as the chapter points out. Things like major developmental changes, say during adolescence, or poor nutrition, infections, even exposure to toxins.
And Chapter 14 also touches on how these environmental factors might have a deeper effect than just being triggers, doesn't it?
Yes, that's a key point. Chapter 14 highlights growing evidence that environmental influences can actually work epigenetically,
Epigenetically, meaning
meaning that environmental factors can change how our genes are expressed without actually altering the DNA sequence itself.
okay, so switching genes on or off.
Kind of like that, yeah. Or dialing their activity up or down. So those stressors can influence gene function, further contributing to the disorder, as Chapter 14 explains. It's like turning a volume dial on a gene.
Okay, so we've got this really intricate interplay of genes and environment, all within the framework of Chapter 14. But what does this actually look like in the brain of someone with schizophrenia? According to the chapter, are there physical differences?
There are indeed. Chapter 14 discusses a pretty consistent finding, a general decrease in brain tissue.
Both gray matter and white matter.
Yes, both the gray matter, the neuron cell bodies, and the white matter, which is the connections, the wiring.
And is this widespread?
The reduction, the chapter notes, has been observed across at least 50 different brain areas. So yeah, widespread impact.
50 areas. Wow. Are some areas affected more than others?
Yes, certain regions, particularly the frontal and temporal lobes, seem to show up most frequently, according to the research outlined in Chapter 14.
Interestingly, Chapter 14 also mentions that the changes in activity aren't always straightforward, like decreased activity in one area but maybe increased in another.
That's right. It can seem paradoxical. For example, Chapter 14 details studies showing decreased activity in the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex.
Which is crucial for...
Things like working memory, executive functions, kind of the brain's to-do list manager.
Okay.
But paradoxically, there can be increased activity in the orbitofrontal cortex and also in a specific subregion of the hippocampus.
The hippocampus. We know from earlier talks that's key for memory. What's going on there, according to Chapter 14?
What's particularly intriguing, as Chapter 14 points out, is that this hippocampal activation seems to be a very early indicator, potentially.
An early indicator. How so?
One study mentioned in the chapter found that in people experiencing brief, sort of psychotic symptoms, the level of activity in this specific hippocampal area could predict with 70% accuracy whether they would later go on to develop full-blown schizophrenia.
70%. That's a potentially powerful early marker, isn't it?
It really is.
Wow. So as Chapter 14 seems to suggest, the focus is maybe shifting from just looking at localized problems to how different brain regions are talking to each other, or maybe not talking effectively.
Exactly. That's a key shift. Chapter 14 emphasizes. Recent research has moved towards understanding disruptions in the coordination, the synchrony of neural activity across different brain regions.
So in healthy brains, areas work together, synchronized.
Right. When you do tasks requiring different areas, you see synchronized activity. But in people with schizophrenia, this synchrony can be, well, absent.
So the insight is it might be less about specific damaged spots and more about a breakdown in communication.
That's a good way to put it. A breakdown in how those regions communicate and coordinate.
Can you give me an example Chapter 14 might highlight?
Certainly. Chapter 14 uses the example of a working memory task. In people without schizophrenia, you typically see activity in the hippocampus and prefrontal cortex rising and falling together in concert.
Okay, working together.
But in individuals with schizophrenia, this coordinated activity is often missing. It's disjointed.
I see.
Similarly, that reduced activity in the prefrontal cortex during the Wisconsin card sorting test, a test of executive function that's been linked to a breakdown in communication between the hippocampus and the prefrontal cortex, as the chapter explains.
And these communication breakdowns, what does Chapter 14 suggest is causing those? Is it related back to the white matter loss you mentioned?
It certainly seems connected. Chapter 14 discusses how those consistent reports of white matter reduction, especially in prefrontal and temporal areas, strongly suggest the physical connections are compromised.
The wiring itself.
Exactly. And advanced imaging, like diffusion tensor imaging, which basically maps the brain's wiring diagram, has shown the overall quality of these connections seems impaired throughout much of the brain.
So it's not just less white matter, but maybe the connections aren't as good.
That seems to be the case. And beyond just white matter, Chapter 14 also notes evidence for decreased cortical thickness, changes in how neurons mature, even reduced folding in key circuits, like the cingulate frontal temporal network.
It sounds like really widespread disruption to the brain's structure and connectivity.
It does. All of this points that way.
And this reduced connectivity does Chapter 14 indicate that it actually maps onto the symptoms we see.
Interestingly, yes. Chapter 14 highlights studies that have found a correlation. Reduced connectivity between those frontal and posterior regions seems linked to both positive symptoms.
Like hallucinations, delusion,
Right, and also the negative symptoms.
flattened effect, social withdrawal, that
Yeah.
sort of thing.
Exactly. And this reduced connectivity also seems to impact performance on cognitive tasks, like that Wisconsin card sorting test again.
Okay, so we've talked genetics, brain structure, brain communication, all drawing heavily from Chapter 14. What about influences even earlier? Like during pregnancy and birth, does the chapter get into that?
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah.
This is another significant area of research Chapter 14 explores. Several prenatal and birth-related factors have been identified as potential contributors to the risk.
Such as?
Things like physical complications during the birth itself, but also significant emotional stress experienced by the mother during pregnancy.
Really? Stress during pregnancy.
Yeah. For instance, Chapter 14 mentions studies linking events like, say, the death of the father during the pregnancy, or even living through a military invasion, to an increased risk in the child later on.
That's powerful. How could maternal stress have such a long-lasting impact, according to Chapter 14? Any clues?
Well, Chapter 14 discusses how animal studies offer some ideas. Research, often with mice, has shown prenatal stress can lead to changes in the density of certain brain receptors.
What kind of receptors?
Specifically, increase in 5-HT2A receptors, that's a serotonin receptor, and a decrease in mGlu2 receptors, which are related to glutamate.
And the connection is?
Interestingly, as the chapter points out, these very same receptor changes have been observed in the brains of individuals with schizophrenia, so the animal models seem to mirror some aspects.
And Chapter 14 also links things like birth complications to those enlarged ventricles you mentioned earlier.
Yes, Chapter 14 notes that in large ventricles, the fluid-filled spaces are sometimes seen, and research discussed in the chapter has shown a connection between physical complications during birth or pregnancy and the later development of these enlarged ventricles.
Could that explain why identical twins might sometimes differ in ventricle size?
It's one possible explanation, yeah. It suggests that even with identical genes, environmental factors during that critical developmental period can play a role in brain structure, as Chapter 14 elaborates.
So it really is this incredibly intricate puzzle, isn't it? Pieces from genetics, environment acting maybe even before birth, and then these widespread effects on brain structure, connectivity, all detailed within Chapter 14.
Absolutely. Understanding psychological disorders like schizophrenia, as Chapter 14 really illustrates, requires us to appreciate this complex interplay. It's almost never just one thing, you know? It's usually a combination of vulnerabilities and challenges that leads to the illness manifesting.
And as we piece this puzzle together for schizophrenia, using Chapter 14 as our guide, it really underscores something important. Researching these disorders isn't just about finding better treatments, although that's crucial.
Right. It's also about gaining a much, much deeper understanding of how the typical human brain actually operates. Precisely. By studying what goes, maybe awry, in these conditions, as Chapter 14 emphasizes, we gain such valuable insights into the fundamental mechanisms of thinking, feeling, behaving in everyone.
This has been a really fascinating deep dive into schizophrenia, guided by Chapter 14. It really makes you think about the sheer complexity of the human brain and how delicate that balance can be. And it leaves you with this thought, right? Given the significant impact of both our genetic makeup and the environments we experience, starting so early, what are the ethical considerations, for interventions aimed at maybe reducing vulnerability or mitigating those environmental risks for mental illness?
That's a really important question to ponder.
Yeah, it's something to really consider the dynamic, multifaceted nature of these conditions and maybe the responsibilities we have as our understanding grows.